Fluttershy snapped awake when a loud explosion rocked the house. A vase that had been placed next to the couch came crashing down, shattering into pieces. "What was that?" she asked, moving quickly to get off the couch. She instantly regretted the last movement, twisting her body in a way that didn't approve, as her chest roared at her in pain. She collapsed on the floor, panting as her chest throbbed. For a moment, she had forgotten about her injuries. She groaned as she carefully sat up, making sure not to offend her wound. She inspected her dressing carefully. Her injuries wouldn't be bled any more than she expected during the sleep of recovery, was about where she could have expected for a bit of sleep. She carefully got to her hooves and took a few steps. She then stretched out her wings before wincing slightly and shutting them back closed. She could move, she could walk, she could fly with a bit of pain, but she still wasn't about to go flying around. "How long was I asleep?" Fluttershy asked out loud. She hadn't meant to fall asleep. Her body had done it almost on its own, as if on instinct. I got separated from Rainbow Dash and Pinkie Pie. I should have been looking for them, not sleeping." Fluttershy felt awful for having to leave her friends alone, even though it was against her will. They were probably worried about her. They must have gone to look for her. "Oh, I hope you two are all right." Fluttershy tried to not let her worries hold her back, before moving to the front of the door of the house that she was in. The door was locked. She stared at the door in shock. The door was locked from the inside. Above the handle to the door, where there was a doll-shaped symbol hovering over the lock. "Why is the door locked?" Fluttershy frowned, staring at the door. She had to get back outside and see what was going on. She then turned around to look at the house in closer detail. It was small, quaint little house, but it didn't look a lot like the house that would normally be built in Ponyville. She hadn't noticed it until just now, but the building material was the kind you would find in Cloud City. Material that was made especially for sitting on clouds. "Huh? This is a cloud house?" Fluttershy looked around baffled. "But the only cloud house in Ponyville is Rainbow Dash's house." Fluttershy was confused. She didn't know whose house it was, as it was certainly not Rainbow Dash's. She then looked at the vase that lay broken on the floor, noticing something unusual about one of the broken pieces. Upon getting closer, she could see that it wasn't really a piece of the vase at all, but something must have been inside the vase when it broke. She carefully picked it up and examined the item. It was a white coin with the shape of a cloud on it, with tiny writing engraved on the edges that read, "The Floating Cloud." She had never been the one to take things from other ponies, but something told her that she was supposed to take this with her. Maybe it was Pinkie's words about something that was going on in this place. Maybe it was a gut instinct, or maybe it was just something about the coin looking valuable. She carefully placed the coin in her bag before looking back up at the house. Her eyes drew the movement that she hadn't noticed before. Outside of the door in the hallway in the house, there were several moths flying around the door. This seemed to odd her. The moths seemed to have no reason to be gathering by the door, unless perhaps there was some kind of food behind the door that they couldn't reach. She walked up to the door and pushed it carefully to open. The door gave away, opening up to what appeared to be someone's study. The moths didn't seem to be moved, still confusing her, but she slowly entered the study regardless. The walls were lined with books on various subjects. She could only recognize several different topics. Most of them were about cloud building. Some were very poetry books, while others looked like business books. They all shared the same markings, though they were books from Cloudstale. Fluttershy slowly walked up to the desk and sat at the end of the room. There was a book open on the desk. Curiosity, however, got the better of her, and she went to read what was on the open page. A patient has shown symptoms of a weakened immune system. The case continues to grow more baffling as is now districts all prior diagnosis of what was wrong. Every step forward causes 2 step backs. I have to start going through the tests to determine what's the cause of her illnesses. I don't have much time though. Her heart is growing weaker, the muscles are growing thinner, and as more time passes, I fear it will rupture before too long. I'll have to start on her on another set of medication. She won't like being on any more drugs, but we have to prolong this for as long as we can. June 23rd, heard 983. Medical case 1156, entry 14. Dr. R.K. Manduas. It was a book recording medical cases throughout the years. The book was open to one of the last entries of the book, recording the case of an unknown disease that had spouted out before the turn of millennium. It seemed that the book explained much more about it in other entries. Huh? Fluttershy looked at one of the pages. It was intended for as if something was lying underneath the page. She lifted up the page to look, seeing a small brown coin with the shape of a house on it. Written in it in tiny text on the coin were the words, "The Old Home." She carefully picked up the coin placing it in her bag. Curious enough as to why the book was open to that particular page, or why the coin had been hiding just underneath it. She had always seen a lot of medical books around the house, and she did read a lot of them. That's how she became so good at tending to the sick and injured. Next to the book, she noticed something looked like a long piece of a fixed string. It was curled up on the desk coil, as if waiting for someone to use it. Oh hey, I think I can use this, Fluttershy thought, as a bulb light that she felt had turned on in her head. She carefully reached into the bag and pulled out the lantern. Her jaw still ached a bit from biting it down, but it certainly didn't hurt as badly now. She placed the lantern on the desk before taking the string and looping it through the handle. She carefully tied the string to a knot, now with the looping onto itself, and she made a makeshift necklace. She carefully placed the necklace around her neck, testing the string. It seemed to be supporting the weight of the lantern just fine, and the lantern just hung from the front of her chest comfortably. She carefully turned on the switch to test how hot the lantern would get. The flame coming to life, she let it sit on her chest for a moment and then walked around slowly. She jumped around as best she could, without making her injuries scream at her. The flame danced in her movement, but it never made the lantern too hot. It felt warm against her coat. The lantern hanging before her gave her a good lighting in front of her. She thought that she would have to turn around if she wanted to see something what was behind her. Oh, Fluttershy, you are so smart. She chuckled softly in her own indigenous. She then turned off the lantern for a moment, since the house had plenty of light for her to see. But now she could still have the light and not hurt her jaw any more than she had to. Nothing else seemed out of the ordinary, though. It was just an average study. She turned around and then headed out of the room, leaving the rest as it is. She looked up at the moths and still circled outside the study. She was still confused at the flight pattern. Her study of moths had showed they usually preferred to travel following the source of light or near the sources of nectar. These particular moths seemed fascinated with circling around the air before the door. She pushed the thoughts out of her mind for a moment, seeing that in front of her was an open doorway to the kitchen. She curiously stepped into it, looking at the small but quaint kitchen. She could smell something sweet. Turning her head to look at the table, seeing a pie simply sitting on it. Who left the pie here? Fluttershy asked curiously, walking up and then taking a look at the pie. It smelled like an apple pie, although there was a particular extra scent to it, as if a special ingredient had been added to its making. The scent reminded her of her mother. There was someone that she hadn't thought of in a long time. Besides the dreams, she hadn't thought about her mother in a long time. She did feel guilty about that. Her mother had died of a disease when she was young, leaving her and her father to tend for themselves. Mother! Fluttershy quietly murmured, trying to remember her mother fondly. Images of the pink-haired mare flashed through her mind briefly, though for some reason they all felt hazy, as if she couldn't focus in on the very memories of her mother. If she had tried to concentrate harder on the memories she remembered liking, It just seemed to haze out even more. Fluttershy rubbed her head in confusion. She never had trouble thinking about her mother before. What was different now? Was it because she was in a strange place? Was it the side effect of Twilight's spell? It was the only thing that made sense to her. She looked at the pie longingly, but although it smelled good, she couldn't bring herself to try it. Something didn't seem right to her about it being here. She thought of something glint next to her, though. Drawing her attention, next to the pie was a gold coin that looked like a young mare on it. In tiny writing words, the trapped mare was written. She instinctively added to her bag alongside with the others. She still wasn't sure what possessed her to collect them. She turned from the table and walked out of the kitchen. The house still seemed small. She was already outside of the last door that she hadn't checked yet. She carefully pushed open the door, peering inside. It was a bedroom, though she could only tell from that being the bed pressed up against the wall. The only other furniture in the room was a drawer with a glass case on it, and on the front of it appeared to be the indentionist. Fluttershy carefully walked up to the desk, getting a better look at it. The intentions were in the shape of coins, with 5 holes. On the glass case she could see a note that had been taped down. Three of the 5 exist in this world. In the morning, noon, and night, the quiet air wind blows through the world, giving the world its shape. When the sun beats down and brings its heat, the cold and water disappear into the sky, awaiting for those to arrive to home that can be built. The world awaits, sitting quietly and empty. It doesn't take long, they arrive and they build. What was once empty now is filled, but though it's filled, it's just not filled with joy or fun. Instead, there is a quiet, unspoken misery. Fluttershy had read the note twice, thinking about what was the note saying. The drawer had 5 spots to fill with coins, which she had brought free with her. Her instincts had yielded results, but now she had to figure out what this meant. She reached into her bag and pulled out 3 of the coins, looking at its shape carefully. Okay, the water is evaporated from the heat of the sun. It becomes vapor, to which the vapor turns into clouds. Fluttershy summarized carefully as she put the floating cloud in the second spot, figuring the first slot must be empty, similar to how the effect of the wind. They built a home in the quiet yet empty quiet. Fluttershy thought before leaving the spot next to the floating cloud, empty and placing the old home in the slot. Then that just leaves this coin in this slot. She then placed the trapped mare in the final slot. The desk let out a loud click, confirming that she had done everything correctly. The glass case on the drawer swung open, revealing a small lever inside of it. Curious, Fluttershy carefully placed her hoof onto the switch and flipped it. Her ears perked up when she heard the sound of something moving. She then turned her head and saw a door-shaped hole had opened in the wall, but there wasn't there before. Inside was a dim staircase that led down into what looked like a basement. Fluttershy looked cautiously down the staircase. It was dark. She couldn't see past a few feet down from them. Her music was still in the silent, so she assumed that there was no trouble just yet. She turned on her light on the lantern and began to make her way down. The walls seemed to be damp as she walked further down in the darkness. There was a faint smell of wet mildew that emanated from the darkness, but she continued to walk further down. She wasn't sure what would be waiting for her, but the area had been so in her instincts told her something was waiting down at the bottom. The stairs flattened out before opening up to a wide basement. Fluttershy looked around, taking in the sight of a gray, moldy walls. She could hear the sound of dripping water, spotting driplets dripping from the walls and the ceiling. The floor had small puddles of water to where the water had collected. Her eyes wandered the rest of the room before noticing something in the corner. It was a small pony doll, worn and torn from all the years gone, covered by the stitches with rotting age. Fluttershy felt a pain of nostalgia just looking at the doll. It was a very similar doll to the one she had as a child. However, the one she owned wasn't so riddled with stitches or aged so badly. It was just sitting in the storage box in her house. Waiting for the next day, she passed it down to a little filial cult of her own one day. Next to the doll was an opened and messy sewing box. Spools of thread and needles were scattered around it, as if someone had dropped it in case of a hurry and left it there. She figured it must have been the case used to help sew the doll back together. She then turned from the doll and Kit, looking around further. Before noticing something glint on the ground, she carefully walked over to it, noticing a key on the ground. She leaned in closer, noticing that the key had a shape of a doll on the end of it. "Oh, this must be the key to the door." Fluttershy smiled before picking it up and placing it in her bag. Now she could hopefully leave this house and start looking for her friends. Her ears perked up when she heard a strange noise from far in the distance. It sounded as if a siren was about to go off, warning the town about something. The sound sent a clip of chill up her back. She couldn't explain why. Something was off-putting by the sound of the siren. She did felt that she had to get out of the basement right away. She turned herself around and quickly began to walk back up the stairs that she had just came down from. But something seemed off. She couldn't tell what it was just right away, but something about the stairs seemed a bit different from when she had just walked down them. The smell of mildew grew stronger, and the steps seemed to be more slick than they had been when she was coming down. The sound of dripping water grew louder. Almost it felt as if water was coming from everywhere. Her ears perked up again at the sound of what sounded like water rushing. She turned to the light up the stairs behind her, hearing it sound from below her. Her eyes widened as she saw water was rapidly beginning to fill the bottom of the stairs. From white froth and the bubbles rage at the surface as the rising water as it filled the stairs. Without wasting a second longer, Fluttershy turned on her hooves and she began to run, panic coursing through her body, pushing her to run as fast as she could. Each steps before her were coated with water, almost causing her to slip, and with each rush step she took, she could hear it quickly filling it up behind her. Drawing closer as she ran, if she didn't get back to the top of the stairs, she was going to drown. Her front hoof slipped, sending her face first into the stairs. She yelped in pain, but quickly stood back up to try to get the shrug the pain off. Her back hoof touched her swelling water as she burst into a full panic. Her legs were stretching out and forcing herself to climb up the stairs, faster than she thought it would be possible for her to do. "I should be out of here by now. The stairs weren't this long. I should be back in that room by now." Her mind screamed as she ran. Her chest was yelling at her, screaming at her that she was being put into much strain. Her face ached with a dull thud. She pushed all over the side, trying to make it fair fought. She couldn't die here, not drowning in some staircase when she needed to find her friends. The water began to splash against the back of her hooves, drawing closer still. She panted heavily as her body was struggling to stay away. The stairwell suddenly made a sharp turn into a large opening, where the stone steps were being replaced with metal fire escape. Circling around a large open shaft, reaching to the sky, Fluttershy couldn't see where it had opened up at, but she wasn't about to stop. She began to run up the metal stairwell, having to turn every few feet to go up the square spiral staircase. The water was swelling up even faster now. Her hooves were doing their best as she could, but that she wasn't going to be fast enough. Her heart leapt out of her chest and in her throat as her breathing became hard from the forced expiration. The water swelled and the back of the hooves falling into the water. Fluttershy cried and did her best to run, but the resistance and churning of the water instantly slowed her down. The water rose up to her legs over her body. Fluttershy took in one final gasp of breath before the water rushed and past her head, finally submerging her. She flailed her hooves in the water, trying to reach the surface. She was panicking. The water current was pushing her body, and she was having a difficulty orientating herself to follow the direction of the rising water. She put everything she could into swimming upwards, but her body was feeling the strain. Her light had gone out when submerged into the water. She was quickly getting disoriented, unable to tell which direction was the right one. The water swirled around her and clawed at her body and mind. She could barely think. The world was quickly beginning to lost to her. Her burning lungs was forced her mouth open, with the air escaping her lungs, wanting to be replaced with fresh oxygen, but only water was awaiting her. She was fading, and she could feel it. She couldn't be in this world much longer. "Come in. The water's fine." Fluttershy smiled happily as she gently floated around the quiet lake, looking at Rainbow Dash, who seemed to be hesitant about entering the water. Sure, I'll be right there." Rainbow forced a smile on her face as she slowly began to put a hoof into the water. She slowly began to walk into the water, though she didn't tread too far. She kept herself about half a leg's length below the water. "Do you not feel like swimming? Because we could do something else, if that's what you want to do," Fluttershy said, slowly swimming next to Rainbow Dash, looking a little worried. "It's not that, it's just..." Rainbow looked away, as if embarrassed. "I can swim, but I'm not really good at it." "Oh, is that all? Well, I can teach you how to swim better," Fluttershy said, smiling comfortably as she swam up next to Rainbow Dash, before standing up in the shallows. "Well, I've never actually been that much practicing on my swimming. After all, I've always been a fast flyer by nature. Water just seems to be a slower comparison, if it's too heavy to get a good momentum going." Rainbow frowned at her brow as she kicked the water. Fluttershy thought about this for a moment before smiling. "Well, I can teach you how to use your wings underneath the water. It's a similar thing to flying, and you can actually get going pretty fast if you do the technique right." "Really? There's a way to do that?" Rainbow said, rather surprised. "Of course, though it does take a lot of practice to get it right. There is a lot of subtle movements that you have to position your body to correctly swim so the water will drag you less as you swim. But that it's possible." Fluttershy smiled proudly, feeling good about something that Dash was interested that she didn't know about yet. "You have to show me. I couldn't cooperate to swimming into my tricks if that's what you say is true." Rainbow grinned eagerly. "Of course I'll show you," Fluttershy giggled softly, before moving back deeper into the waters. "Now watch carefully." She spread her wings underwater as she prepared to show off to Rainbow Dash for the first time. Fluttershy's eyes shot open in the dark waters as she spread her wings out. Her hooves flailed around for a moment. Before catching the railing on the metal staircase, she put her hind legs on the rail as her wings adjusted, battered to the current, but she could do this. She kicked off with her back legs and she moved her hooves forward, flattening her body as she began to move rapidly in the water. Her wings bent and moved as they very carefully moved like the rush in water. Moving the water around her wings to give it the forward of movement, she could feel the water rushing all around her, trying to drag her back down. She began to flap her wings precisely, scooping the water and pushing against it, thrusting herself forward as she slipped gracefully into the water. Her mind and her body reeled and ached as she screamed and tried to tear her apart from the relief of her pain, from the inferno in her chest, from the wounds telling her she needed to stop. Nothing could make her go. She gritted her teeth and narrowed her eyes, flapped her wings with every last ounce of strength that she could muster. As she swam through the dark abyss, needing an exit, a dim light filled the edge of her vision, and she spread her wings far, grabbing as much water as she could and powering them into a thrust to her at the edge of the light. A loud gasp echoed amongst the sound of splashing water as her head resurfaced from the water. She coughed and gasped, hacking and wheezing, as she scrambled for the edge of the water. Grabbing a hold of the floor, she threw both her hooves on the ground, holding her up as her lungs accepted the sweet, sweet relief of air. Her head was throbbing mad, like her body had felt like it had been torn apart, and every muscle in her body was telling her that she was lucky to be alive. She coughed up the water that entered her lungs. She grimaced unpleasantly as the pain became more and more apparent to her. Her echoing pants bounced back into her ears, making her realize just how lucky she truly was. For a moment she had accepted death as an inevitability, and that she would have no choice but about to die in that cold, watery hell. The water was cold, and she hadn't noticed her panic, but she could feel herself shivering as she floated into the now calm water. She groaned as she pulled herself up, causing strength to leave and escape the water. She managed to drag herself out of the water, slowly before pulling her tail out as well. She lay on the floor panting, drenched in the cold water, breathing heavily as she ached. She felt her eyelids slowly closing, wanting to drift off to sleep to calm down. No! Her mind had snapped at her, forcing her eyes back open. Fluttershy, you almost drowned, not to mention that you're drenched from the freezing water. If you go to sleep without anyone around you, you may never wake up again. The oxygen desperation may put you in a coma, and sleeping in this cold could result in hypothermia. You cannot go to sleep right now. She panted as she could feel the onset of her panic returning. Her medical training was coming back to her now. It was fine before with some lacerations and bruising, but this was much more serious. She couldn't go to sleep. She had saved her own life, and she wasn't going to slip away from her so easily. She tried to stand up, get back on her hooves as her legs shook tremulously. She could barely put any weight on them before they slipped under her hoof. She felt that her heart rate accelerating. Good, stay awake. Panic might just be my friend right now. She grunted as she did her best to stand. She had to get up. She had to start walking. With the last of her strength, she found her legs and was standing. Her legs were shaking like mad, but she was standing. She carefully began to shake her whole body, harder than her body's natural shaking. The water in her coat had scattered as best as she could muster. There was no way she could get it all off with her being so tired, though. She tried to look around for something to support her, but the light was too dim to see anything. She looked back at the lantern that was pressed by smartly against her chest. She needed the warmth of the flame right now. She clicked on the lantern, flipping the switch several times. She prayed despite the water logging that it would still work for her. By some miracle, the flame appeared once more. Somehow the oil in the wick was still reusable. Her head was groggy, shaking, as the world seemed to spin around her, but she did her best not to get a look at the world. She was still in a small square room with a doorway, what seemed to be like a lobby outside. A large square hole was in the middle of their current room, filled with the water that she had just escaped from. She carefully began to walk out of the room and out of the cold water into the lobby. Every step made her body shudder and cry, putting her on the verge of collapsing with each step. She needed towels to dry off. She needed to wrap up in something warm. She needed to put some food and drink into her. She carefully walked towards the desk and saw right in front of her. There were a few things on top of that she instantly took notice of, and there was a map of where she was. It read Cloudsdale Hospital in bold letters before showing the layout of the 2-story building. Cloudsdale Hospital? She stammered out of unintentionally. She could hear the virality of her voice, but she had spoken away. This hospital, where her father had worked, was the best doctor of all of Cloudsdale and had several lives more than of her doctors had combined. It was thanks to him that she had learned all those medical knowledge, that she had taken care of the animals and sick ponies. If she was in a hospital, she was sure to find all the supplies that she'll need to take care of herself in. Fluttershy quickly took note of one of the patient rooms were, and she had to come back and pick up the map. Her bag would soak and the map would ruin for its use for her in the moment. The next thing she saw on the desk was a bottle that labeled health drink. She remembered from her visits to the hospital that there was a special type of medicine that helped relax and heal the body. She needed that right now. She carefully unscrewed the top of the drink before pouring the contents into her mouth. As she chugged the whole bottle hungrily, the mixture tasting a bitter like strawberries, but felt soothing going down her throat. She finished the drink and gave it a moment to sink in. Almost instantly, she felt some exhaustion begin to wane as the pain in her had been screaming at her began to fade. Growing numb, her eyesight strained more, and her mind lost some of the foggy haze that had been floating around. She could tell that the drink had a painkiller effect to it, and she wasn't truly feeling better just yet. She was still elevating the pain so that she could feel better. It was now with her head feeling clearer that she was still able to get a good look at the lobby for the first time. The floor was made of rustic steel that was growing some kind of mold in the walls that were falling apart from the age, mold, and being soaked with water. The roof was caving in many places. Waiting chairs and tables had been falling apart, in pieces torn to shreds. There were overturned wheelchairs and gunneries. Some spots on the floor had bloodstains on them. The whole room seemed to scream as if nothing but a vile place. Fluttershy turned her attention away. She didn't want to focus on the state of the room. She had attended her body's needs first. Before she left, she read the lasting notice on the lobby's desk, and the last note looked like it was written hastily with a red pen. I locked it away. It can't hurt us anymore. The staring, oh, Luna, the staring. They erected it, but it won't go away. It's judging us. It knows, but it can't hurt us without it. I locked it away. But should I need to have this code? Hide. Well, the note didn't really make any sense to her at the moment, but she felt that it must be important. She'd come back for it as well. She stepped away from the counter, taking up her new vigor and to move past through the double doors. Behind it, she stepped into the hallway, one that she was familiar from her childhood. Though the place had aged into despair, she still recognized it. She quickly made her way over to the first room she could find and pushed it open. Inside was an examination room. Although the cabinets were falling apart and the table looked like it had been fallen into disuse, it was still in an examination room. Fluttershy carefully removed her saddlebag from her back and placed it onto the table before moving to the broken counters. She found various supplies, fresh bandages, a few more health drinks, towels and gauze, pads, everything she needed to get herself feeling back from the top form. As she began to work delicately on drying herself and applying fresh bandages, she didn't notice the soft hissing that began to emanate from the music box in her bag.